We're going to reconvene. And because the sun's gone in a bit, we're putting Christian's PowerPoint back on just in case anybody wants to see something that it was actually impossible to see earlier. So this is really a free-for-all and an open space where you can raise anything you want. And I've got this microphone which you may or may not need. I probably don't need it. But you know, we can pass it around if it's difficult to hear. And Aline and Christian are here to discuss with you rather than just answer endless questions. Right. So now, having said that, Chris is going to say something. This is Chris Ganley from the National Galleries of Scotland, who is probably was one of the most important people for us in this partnership, like 3 to 5 years. That's you, Chris. No pressure.
Okay. I suppose to Christian's question, my answer would just be no.
So that now the challenge is to remember the question.
Was Baselitz fair in his criticism of Richter for not being true to German tradition and sort of selling out to an American idea of art?
Although one of the things that's slightly off piece I was thinking about when you were speaking, but maybe it's because I always associate you with him, is I had thought about the relationship between 48 portraits and August Sander.
Yes.
Because they brought kind of similar questions about gender, occupation, social standing, and all those kinds of things, but also they just makes me think that Richter is just a bit kind of mysterious.
Right. I mean, the 48 portraits, they're all kind of dead white European males, right?
Yeah.
That's probably too dark. Although it's quite good because we can see the pictures. Let's leave it a minute. Yeah.
Will we keep it that way?
Yeah, keep it that way for a minute. God, we can really see them.
Will you do the presentation again?
Well, I can maybe go through slowly, but I was just trying to find the 48.
This was the end.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. When I was studying university, my first degree in the 90s was a campaign against dead white European males. It seems to be encapsulated in 48 portraits, but of course these are not, Richter was stressing they're not political or military leaders, they're cultural figures. And Kiefer's response, was rather different. But you're right about August Sander, this idea of seriality, typology, taxonomy. These are words that come to mind as well. But of course, Sander's project, people of the 20th century, was very diverse in terms of class groups and gender and ethnicity, and this is extremely uniform. So what were you saying, Chris, about?
Well, I think it's just interesting because some of the sitters are sometimes the same in Sander's project and the ones that are in 48 projects.
There's actually a connection
in
that respect, yeah, for sure.
And also it's a kind of interesting tie to the other question about this found photograph as opposed to one that's been taken by the artist themselves. Because the thing that's interesting about the work in art rooms is that it's an addition, so it's a painting of a photograph that's then photographed to become an addition.
That's right. And there are 4 sets, is that right? And Anthony Duffy has one of those sets.
Yeah.
I know, that's a curious thing, isn't it?
It is, and it's also quite a controversial work in terms of how it's displayed, and I know it's been, there's been a lot of tensions about how it's been displayed in the past in the museums, and it has to be at a certain height, and I think various museums have tried to display it in different ways, and it hasn't had the kind of impact that it was. I think it was a Venice Biennale when it was originally.
That's right.
It's almost as a kind of installation piece in itself.
That's right. I mean, Richter said this was perfect for the Venice Biennale.
Yeah.
I saw it actually at Plymouth when the photographic set was just like this. up against the wall. But yeah, that was these are the paintings in the Venice Biennale setting.
Good. Someone at the back. Were you asking a question?
No.
Oh, you were waving like that. Oh, here we are. Somebody else is. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of add to Chris's point about these, is that some people may know that there's been lots of interns writing about or works in the Artist Rooms collection, and this was one of the works that an intern wrote about a couple of years ago, and it was very difficult to write about because the text on the Tate website that we've been writing always start with a description of the work, and that was the most difficult thing because this work has got that curious sort of aspect of being a set of photographs on a set of paintings on a set of photographs. So you have to get around, just the practicalities of describing what that is before you even get into talking about what it might be about. But anyway, that's just a kind of observation to make, and something to say because this is the last cafe as well. If people want to go and Google things afterwards.
Good. So, yeah, good.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much to everybody for a most interesting evening. Really enjoyed it. The question which I thought was basically boiling down to, is it better to be internationalist or nationalist in your approach as an artist? I think it's really complicated actually. I mean, my first thought was, there's no problem in being both. And then I thought, wait a minute, with globalisation and homogenisation, I mean, what we don't want is, it's like wine all tasting the same, we don't want art all looking the same. But I still feel on balance that most artists, whether they like it or not, are going to have to be a bit of both, because we're obviously all a product of the culture that we were born into. But at the same time, obviously nowadays we're exposed to influences from all over the world, we can't avoid that. But even I think if you go back several hundred years, so do correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, for example, the Renaissance, you might have an Italian artist who was maybe painting a scene from Italian history or a particular Italian saint, but he'd be using symbolism in the paintings that you'd find the same symbolism in a German artist of that period or a French artist or whatever. So basically, I think the answer to the question is both, if you sort of see what I mean. Sorry, that was awful waffle. Thanks very much.
So you've had no and both. Do you want,
yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm just always a bit nervous when people start saying, oh, someone is abandoning their national tradition, because it reminds me of what happened to, I think, at least one Russian modernist immediately, sort of, pre-revolution in 1917, and I think he was criticised basically because his work had actually, as it was put, I think, by the I think it was one of the Russian patriarchs or something like that, for having sort of rejected the Russian tradition. The next thing is the guy was up on the charge of heresy. So I think you've got to be a bit careful when you start criticising people for sort of changing the style.
do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, the criticism was, as I say, directed by Bartlett to Richter in that period in the 1960s. And in a sense, this is not kind of particularly new. So you had an artist like Emil Nolde. Bartlett has often been compared to Emil Nolde, a first-generation expressionist, who was for about 18 months a member of the Baroque group. But he left the Baroque because he said their intense collaboration, but also their indebtedness to French prototypes was problematic for him. He saw himself as deeply Germanic, from Schleswig-Holstein, very much grounded, if you like, in a kind of German tradition. And so with Bartlett's criticising Richter for his internationalist vision or his interest in American art, there's a kind of cyclicality about that in a curious way. It's certainly not my perspective. I think that today, I mean, Bartlett says all kinds of provocative things. He's a provocateur, specialises in it. Particularly some rather deeply unpleasant remarks about women artists a few years ago, but that's something else. But yeah, I mean, he sees himself in a German tradition. He did have a period in Italy, and he said he was deeply influenced by Italian mannerism. He has a huge collection of Italian mannerist prints, chiaroscuro prints, and he said Italy had a strong impact on him. But actually, he is like Nolde, I think, very much a German artist. Richter is different. I mean, I do think the fact that Richter doesn't use wood. Now I'll come back to that.
You're obsessed with wood.
I am obsessed with it because Richter represents the wood. He represents the forest and trees, but he doesn't use the material in the way that Baselitz and Kiefer do in their carving, in their woodcuts. And I think that's quite significant. I think it's almost a sort of his interest in mechanical procedures and photography, a detachment, in a sense, to the organic, maybe there. I don't know if you agree with that, Lee.
I think that one thing with Richter is that he doesn't like to be pinned down as anything, and he probably doesn't want to be pinned down as a German neo-expressionist or national artist or whatever. And one of the things that was very controversial is, I think, I don't know if we could see do you have a picture of the Weikop
Yeah.
paintings? When he painted the series called October 1977, of which the picture to the right here is taken, which represents a very German moment in history, right? The death and the arrest of the Baden-Meinhof members. At first, this was a 10-year loan to a German museum, and then after that, he sold it to MoMA, and that was perceived very badly from a German perspective, that he was exporting German culture or giving up German culture, and that it wouldn't be received in the same way in the US, because of course the context was completely different. And yeah, I wonder whether that's one of the way he plays with, tackling a very German subject matter, and then suddenly saying, oh yeah, it's fine, it's going to go to MoMA, no problem. And he has a bit of a sort of maverick attitude sometimes, trying to not being pinned down as a certain thing.
I'm going to come back to the wood very briefly. I mean, interestingly, both Gerhard Richter and Baselitz have said they both really wanted to be foresters before they became artists. Yeah, they were both deeply interested in that. Yeah. So I think aside from October '77, I mean, look, Gerhard Richter's book called Val. And
he's trying to convince us that there's
I'm trying to convince you that Richter is really a romantic artist.
Actually, the series of Richter, apart from photo paintings, also made they're called overpainted photographs. I don't know if you've come across them. So they're little snapshot that he's overpainted with oil paint or sometimes varnish, and quite a lot of them are of landscape. And I think that actually plays with the heritage of the landscape in German culture with this particular works. Perhaps less obviously than Kiefer, who's very laying painter, very obvious way, that's heritage, etc. So Richter never does that. But there are some striking similarities in sort of obsession with the Alps, the landscape, the mountains, and the forest, the pine forest, which is the next step after the oak forest has disappeared. The German landscape becomes a pine forest landscape. So there is something there, definitely, and I think it's not at all apolitical. I think there's something there to do with national history.
So we've had covered as an answer to this question about should an artist be international or national. I'd like to offer the answer no. By which I mean the artist shouldn't have to be one or the other. I think for a start with the artistic freedom, the artist him or herself should decide what they're going to do their art about. And they're probably going to do it about what they believe in, or the social issues of the day, or the politics. Now, of course, second half of 20th century Germany, identity was a big issue, and a lot of artists addressed it, including both Baselitz and Richter, as we've heard. But I don't think either of them were forced to do that, or should be forced by any other artists to do that. So, if that's what Baselitz wants to do, and that's what Richter doesn't want to do, I think that's fine. And I agree with the lead.
But this is about competing ways of making a career, though, isn't it? As well, how do you establish your achievement as an artist? And I mean, I know Christians make connections, but there are really important differences between.
Well, I think any artist also draws on their own background and growing up and cultural identity, so there's a sense of national identity there. Hence the romanticism of Richter or the alveolism of Baselitz. So they're the product of the environment they came from. But you should be constrained by that. So if Richter wants to is it on?
I'm just confiscating it.
Oh, yeah.
I would just say that I think like any German artist working at that time would have to be thinking in terms of nationalism, because to be an artist post-war, you would have to position yourself in terms of the National Socialists, who of course used the landscape as part of their vision and their visual language. So, you know, the words, the landscape, that was all part of the National Socialist vision or idea or myth. And so in a way, I think for these artists, for German artists in particular, they can't escape from their nationalism. And some, for example, went to America. So, you know, like filmmakers like Fassbinder, they turned to America. And, you know, other artists, perhaps, you know, the tree, the wood, you know, that's the kind of the archetypal German sort of image. So it's not surprising that they all use that image, but they have to also create a distance to that, or a statement. You know, they just cannot go on with their work without establishing that.
Yes, I mean it's not a continuity in that sense. With Baselitz and Kiefer, there is discontinuity there. There's a rupture in the tradition because of World War II, partially. But in response to that, if I can, Neil, just quickly, I would say that, you know, abstraction dominates in the 1950s through the documenters, in particular Werner Haffmann and various other German critics, curators. They really promote an art that is free of troublesome content. So the problem for Baselitz and Kiefer was that they were reintroducing an imagery, if you like, that was forbidden, was taboo. And so, and hence the controversy around the Venice Biennale in 1980, and the interpretation of these artists as, in some quarters, as neo-fascist, a kind of misunderstanding of what they were attempting to do. But certainly in the 50s, abstract art, what Baselitz said was a bloodless abstraction, was a kind of dominant mode. And so when he introduces the figure, again, with Big Night Down the Drain, in the most grotesque way, I don't know if you want to see that word, grotesque way possible, it's a very kind of effective statement, if you like.
I suppose I just wanted to say about that idea, should an artist be a nationalist or an internationalist? I just think in this case, they couldn't escape that. They can't really
No, I
say
agree.
I'm an internationalist, they have to be a nationalist as well.
Sure, yeah.
I'm a bit troubled by the idea that if someone's living in a historical context or a country, and inevitably some of the work and their artistic freedom is expressed from that context, that it's then turned on its head as if it's something conscious, as if it's something they're trying to do. And the only interview I've seen with Richter, I think it was with the curator of the Tate Modern, who was making out all sorts of ideas and putting it to Richter, and all Richter said was yes.
Was it a recent interview when he had his retrospective
I think it was
5 years ago?
Yeah.
He was particularly tame in that interview. He just said yes all the time.
Well, I wondered if he was actually stating his position.
Yeah, I don't think he was, because a lot of his interviews, there's the same pattern. The interviewer will, come up with all of these interpretations and put them to Richter, and in the past he usually says no. So an example is Benjamin Bourgeot, who has been his friend for a long time and has a very theoretical approach to his work, and will ask these very long-winded questions and blah 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 blah, and Richter just says no. And I was actually surprised when I saw this interview, because he seemed to be a lot more agreeing a bit too much. Yeah.
Well, I think it was a caricature really of that sort of interview where it was other people's ideas, and it was almost caricatured here where we were talking about Richter and the pictures have disappeared. It's like the artistic activity of saying something that is different from words. I just use the word different, but it's not words.
But wasn't that interview in English?
It was, yes.
Because that's what I thought actually. I thought because I've seen interviews of Richter in German, and he's a lot more loquacious and has a lot of very sharp sense of humor. He doesn't give away any more than he does in English, but he's a lot more present as a speaker. And I wondered whether that was the language was a factor actually.
Somebody should do a PhD on artist interviews in the 20th century because it's quite an interesting genre. My favourite ones are the Jasper Johns ones. If anyone, read the Jasper Johns interviews; they're fantastic. Absolutely, amazing works of evasion. Studied evasion, really good. Anyone else want to come in?
I was going to say, just pick up a little bit on Ruth's point as well about writing about Richter, and I can't think of anything worse than reading Benjamin Beacle writing about Richter, other than reading Robert Storr writing about Gerhard Richter. And I think that these people quite often get caught in loops talking about Richter, and I think it's because what you said about pinning him down. And I think sometimes he's just a bit mischievous, and I don't think there's I'm dumbing it down slightly, but I don't think there's a huge amount more to it than that, than him being playful quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think it's tricky to write about Richter.
I mean, Buchler and Richter have this extraordinary relationship where Buchler will say one thing, say, oh, there's an anti-painterly impulse about your painting, and Richter will say, no, I'm just simply a painter. You're over-theorising it. So there's a kind of interesting dialogue between a critic who's a champion of Richter.
And then Buchler will go on to write, Richter has got an anti-painterly attitude.
Yes, that's right. There's a sort of disjunction between artist intention and critical perspective. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the painting, can you go to the September painting
Yeah.
that you had? Just the actual process of these things is really interesting. That one's really complex. September, the 9/11 picture, which is because the 1977, the October 1977 series, there are quite large pictures,
Yeah,
right? And there's a lot of them. And this is a small painting.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like this.
And as I understand it, Aline, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the towers. And then this is a explosion or something like, isn't it? This is fire on the other tower or something like
I
that.
think it's one of the famous, it's taken from one of the famous
Yeah.
photographs that,
Yeah.
we will see.
Exactly.
Or is it a screenshot? I don't know.
Yeah.
But, it's recognizable to everybody, I think.
And I think he originally painted it in quite close to the photograph, and then he's squeegeed it, right? So it's not just that, because on the Emma thing, it's with a brush, this kind of.
Right.
But this is
Yes,
the
he's
whole.
actually applying the technique he uses with to make abstract paintings. I don't know if you've seen the little one of the postcards is one of his abstract paintings, and we've seen a few in your talk as well, where he will apply several layers of paint and then
With a sponge or something, or
it's this big rakes of wood that he goes across the painting with. And
This is
you
a
see
windscreen
wood.
wiper.
yeah, like a window squeegee almost, right?
Yes, as well, yeah. But I think, I don't know if anybody has seen the documentary that Corinna Belts has made of his work. I think it's called Gerhard Richter painting or something helpful like that. Anyway, she gained access to his studio and filmed him painting, and mostly abstract painting. And you see him using these huge, very long wooden rakes that he drags across. Anyway, what's interesting in this one is that it's a photo painting, it's figurative painting, but he's using the technique that he uses for his abstract paintings to make it and to blur it.
And he went upwards as well with this one, right? So it's gone across, and there's that gesture as well. So kind of, I suppose this is just a way of getting around to the photographic conditions problem. Or is it anti-painting? Is it paint? In what sense is it anti-painting when it's so painterly as well? You know, that's a very weird. It is a weird trick that he does, really. I think. I don't know whether you might have any observations on that, but I think that's the core of it. Yeah.
I think if you look on it as the view from the windscreen of the second plane, it makes sense. Because basically it's the blurred image just before the second. You're in the second plane just before it hits the other tower.
I mean, you know, in that atlas, that he has these, you know, he's put these kind of colour photos, which I think they were, like say, screen grabs or something. I'm not sure. So you can see various shots that he's used in thinking about this.
Yeah, the atlas is quite useful in tracking down the original photographs. Although they're not always the one that he's used, but he usually keeps a selection of the photographs he's thinking of using, and sometimes also the actual source, photographic source. And you can compare the painting and the photograph.
Okay. Unless anyone's got anything else.
Why no more Aphrodite?
Well, so there won't be any more exactly of these, I think, because our partnership is coming to an end. However, I think we will run some more events like this with perhaps a bit more breadth than just focused on artist rooms. So what we might be talking about with National Galleries of Scotland is doing something that's more broadly focused around the collections here. So I hope we will continue to do something. It probably won't be immediately next year, because I'm going on research leave. And, indeed, it's a celebration. And sadly, that we also won't be appointing a team of interns like the ones that have actually delivered all of these cafes and film screening events. And can I ask them all to come up here? All the interns, please. Come up here. Where are you, interns? They're not all here, but almost. Some. This is 5 of the 11 interns who have run all these events this year, and there was a team the year before and a team the year before, and I just want to give them a round of applause. And they are now free to do their dissertations. And the only other thing I want to do is to thank our speakers for a really fascinating meeting. Very much. I will see you again at another kind of event. All right.